The rain was falling in sheets over the city that night. The kind of cold, punishing rain that made the neon signs bleed into the puddles like open wounds. And in the back kitchen of Ristorante Corvino, the most exclusive restaurant on the east side, a man in a $3,000 suit was lying on the tiled floor, his lips turning the color of old ash. Nobody moved. The waiters stood frozen. The sous chef was screaming into a phone. The maître d' was crossing himself. And the man on the floor, the man whose name made bankers stutter and senators return calls within 30 seconds, was dying. Only one person in that kitchen understood what was happening. And she was the last person any of them would have expected. She was standing by the industrial dishwasher, her hands still wet, her apron soaked through, her name tag crooked on her chest. Her name was Marisol Vega. She was 31 years old. She was a large woman, with a full round face, soft double chin, heavy arms, a broad torso, and wide hips. And she had been washing dishes at Ristorante Corvino for exactly 7 months and 11 days. And in that single frozen second, as everyone else in the kitchen stared at the dying man in useless horror, Marisol dropped the plate she was holding, felt her heart slam once against her ribs, and started running. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back. You have to go back to a woman nobody ever really looked at. A woman who arrived at the service entrance every afternoon at 3, who never made eye contact with the head chef, who apologized when people bumped into her, who ate her dinner standing up next to the trash chute because there were no chairs in the back. Marisol Vega had come to the city 3 years earlier, with a suitcase, a diploma she could not use, and a heart full of quiet, stubborn hope. In her home country, she had been a nurse, a very good one. She had worked in a cardiac unit for 6 years. She had trained under a chief cardiologist who called her his best student, and she had known the rhythm of a failing heart the way other people knew the melody of a favorite song. But diplomas from other countries did not always translate. Papers got lost, certifications got denied, fees stacked on fees, and slowly, painfully, Marisol had watched her savings drain away, while she waited for a system that seemed designed to make her disappear. She had taken the dishwashing job because it paid in cash on Fridays. She had taken it because her landlord did not care about her medical background, only about the rent. She had taken it because at 31, alone in a country that did not want to see her, she had run out of other options. The other kitchen staff mostly ignored her. The head chef, a red-faced man named Bruno, shouted at her when the plates came back streaked, and ignored her when they did not. The waiters, sleek and young and hungry, treated her like a piece of the machinery. The only person who ever really spoke to her was Elena, a cheerful line cook from Puebla who slipped her extra bread rolls and told her again and again that she was worth more than this. "You are wasting yourself, Mia," Elena would say, dusting flour off her hands. "You have the hands of a healer, and here you are, scrubbing the risotto off other people's plates." Marisol would only smile softly and shrug. "The plates need washing too," she would say. She had told almost no one about her past. It felt too painful, too much like admitting to a defeat, so she washed, she scrubbed, she kept her head down. And every night, walking home under the yellow streetlights, she practiced the names of medications in her head, the dosages, the contraindications, terrified she would forget the woman she used to be. There was one thing, though, one small thing, that made Ristorante Corvino different from every other kitchen job she had ever heard of. The Corvino table. At the very back of the dining room, tucked into a curved velvet alcove behind a wall of frosted glass, there was a table that was never listed on the reservation system. It was permanently held for one person. A man who came in twice a week, always on Tuesdays and Fridays, always at 9 sharp, always alone or with one silent companion. The staff called him only Mr. Corvino, or, when they were sure he could not hear them, the boss. His full name was Dante Corvino, and Marisol had learned, through overheard whispers and Elena's wide-eyed murmurs, that he owned not only this restaurant, but 3 hotels, a shipping company, half the property on this side of the river, and, if the rumors were true, most of the people who made decisions about who could and could not do business in this city. He was, in every whispered version, the head of an old and terrifyingly disciplined organization. A silent king in a city full of noise. Marisol had seen him exactly 4 times. The first time had been on her second week. She had been carrying a rack of clean glasses through the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the dining room. When he had turned the corner in front of her, she had gasped, stumbled, and almost dropped everything. He had caught the rack. She would remember, for the rest of her life, the way his hand had shot out calm and precise, and steadied the tower of glass before a single one could tip. She would remember the size of his hand, the weight of the silver ring on his little finger, the scent of his cologne, dark and clean and expensive. She would remember, most of all, his eyes. He was impossibly tall, impossibly handsome, in a severe, carved way that made her feel like she was looking at a statue rather than a man. His hair was black and silver at the temples. His suit was a shade of charcoal, so deep it looked like the color of a shadow. And his eyes, when they met hers, were the strangest gray she had ever seen. Pale, cold, terrifyingly calm. "Careful," he had said. Just that, one word. And then he had walked past her, and she had stood there, shaking, her heart pounding, for reasons she could not name. She had seen him 3 more times after that. Once from the kitchen door, glimpsing his profile through the frosted glass. Once when he had walked in from the rain, shaking water off his coat, and had glanced for one strange second directly at her through the pass. And once, months later, when she had been sent to sweep the back hallway near his alcove, and she had heard him speaking to another man in a low, level voice. She had not meant to listen. She had frozen because the voice was so quiet and so absolute that she could not move. "I do not want them touched," Dante Corvino had said, "not their homes, not their families. When we correct a problem, we correct only the problem. That is the line." The other man had said, "Yes, boss." And Marisol had backed away with her broom, feeling like she had accidentally overheard a prayer. She did not know why. But from that day on, she thought about him more than she meant to. Not in any romantic way, she told herself. Only in the way a person thinks about a lightning storm they once stood too close to. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that Dante Corvino had noticed her too. He had noticed her on her very first day. He had walked through the back kitchen, as he did once a month, to inspect the operation, and he had seen a curvy, soft-framed woman with tired, kind eyes standing at the dishwasher, her hands red from the hot water, humming quietly to herself as she worked. He had watched her for perhaps 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds he had seen more than most people saw in a lifetime. He had seen a woman who was too gentle for the room she was in. He had asked Bruno her name that same night. Bruno, sweating, had stammered it out. Dante had nodded once, and said nothing else. But the next morning a man named Silvio, Dante's oldest friend, and his most trusted second, had received a very short instruction. Find out everything about her. Silvio, who had known Dante for 30 years, and had never once seen him ask about a woman who worked in one of his kitchens, had raised one eyebrow so high it almost disappeared into his hairline. "Everything, boss, everything," Dante had said. Without looking up from his newspaper, 2 days later Silvio had placed a slim folder on Dante's desk. Marisol Vega, 31. Widowed at 26 when a drunk driver had killed her young husband 3 months into their marriage. Registered nurse in her home country, 6 years of cardiac experience, top of her class. Immigration files stuck in a bureaucratic loop that had been quietly, deliberately, engineered by an official who was demanding bribes she could not pay. No family in this country, one close friend, a co-worker named, sends money home to her mother every month, always the same amount, always on the 15th. Dante had read the file twice. Then he had closed it, laid his hand flat on the cover, and looked out his office window for a long, long time. By the end of that week, the corrupt immigration official had been transferred to a distant regional office by his own agency, following an anonymous but devastatingly detailed complaint. Port. Marisol's paperwork had begun, mysteriously, to move forward. Her mother, back home, had received a scholarship notice for a health program she had never applied to, one that came with a small monthly stipend that matched, almost exactly, the amount Marisol sent every month. Marisol never knew. She thought she had gotten lucky. She thought the world had finally, quietly, decided to give her a small break. She did not know that a silent king had built a small, invisible fortress around her life. And she did not know that on Tuesdays and Fridays, when Dante Corvino sat alone at the back table with a glass of red wine he barely touched, he was not thinking about business. He was watching. Through the sliver of open kitchen door, a woman in a wet apron humming to herself as she worked. And he was thinking, very slowly, that in 30 years of ruling an empire, he had never once felt what he felt when he looked at her. He was thinking he did not know what to do about it. For a man who had never lost a battle he had chosen to fight, this was, perhaps, the most disorienting thing that had ever happened to him. Silvio had noticed, of course. Silvio noticed everything. "You are staring at the kitchen again, boss," Silvio would murmur, sipping his espresso. "I am reviewing operations." "Ah, yes, the dishwasher is a very important operation." Dante would not answer. Silvio would smile into his cup. "You know," Silvio said one evening, as they walked out into the rain, "for a man who owns the whole building, it is strange that you cannot walk 20 steps and simply say hello. It is not the right time. When will it be the right time?" Dante had stopped by the car and had looked up at the black sky and had said so quietly that Silvio almost missed it, "When I am sure I will not ruin her life by touching it." Silvio, for once, had said nothing. That was where things stood on the night the rain came down in sheets. That was where things stood on the night Marisol Vega dropped the plate she was holding and started running across a kitchen full of frozen people. But before we come to that moment, we have to talk about the humiliation. Because before the dying, there was the cruelty. And that cruelty was the first crack that shook everything loose. It happened on a Friday 2 weeks earlier. A large private party had booked the front room of Ristorante Corvino. The son of a wealthy real estate developer was celebrating an engagement. The guests were young, loud, and drunk on their own reflection. The bride-to-be was a thin, sharp-eyed woman who laughed too loudly at her own jokes. The groom was a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s named Marco Falzone, whose father had made a fortune tearing down old neighborhoods and calling the rubble progress. Marco Falzone was drunk before the appetizers arrived. Marisol had been asked, unusually, to help carry a heavy tray of dessert plates through to the pass because 2 of the waiters were sick. She never entered the dining room. Never. She was a back-of-house person. She knew this. But Bruno had barked at her and pointed, and she had wiped her hands, adjusted her apron, and gone. She was walking, very carefully, along the edge of the room, trying to be invisible, when Marco Falzone had stuck out his foot. She did not see it. She tripped. The tray flew from her hands. 12 tiramisus, meticulously plated with cocoa dust and gold leaf, sailed into the air and came down in a slow, terrible arc across the white tablecloth, across Marco's suit, across the front of his fiancée's silk dress. For one long second, there was silence. Then Marco Falzone stood up. "You," he said in a low, poisonous voice. "You fat cow." Marisol froze, her cheeks burned. Her eyes stung. She began, immediately, to apologize. "I am so sorry, sir. I did not see. Please let me help you clean. I will pay for the dress." "I will. You will pay for it?" Marco laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "With what?" "With the pennies they pay you to scrub dishes. Look at yourself. Look at the size of you. You cannot even walk across a room without knocking things over. Who let this thing into the dining room?" The whole restaurant went quiet. Marisol stood there, dessert dripping down her apron, tears rising in her eyes, her hands trembling. His fiancée laughed. A high, cruel laugh. "Marco, be nice. She probably has never even seen a dress like this. She would not know how to clean it." "Get on your knees," Marco said suddenly. Marisol blinked. "Excuse me?" "Get on your knees and clean it up. With your hands right now. And apologize properly. Or I will make sure they fire you tonight, and you never work in this city again. Do you know who my father is? Do you?" Marisol felt the room tilt. She had been called many things in her life. She had been called too big, too foreign, too slow, too soft. She had learned to swallow all of it. But something about that word, on her knees, spoken in that voice, in front of a room of silent watching people, cracked something inside her that she did not know could crack. She began, very slowly, to lower herself. She did not know what else to do. And that was the moment when a voice from the back of the room said, very calmly, "That will not be necessary." Every head turned. Dante Corvino was standing at the edge of the frosted glass alcove. He had not been expected, he was not on the reservation, for that night. Nobody had seen him come in. And yet there he was, in a black suit, his face carved out of stone, his pale eyes fixed on Marco Falzone with an expression that made 3 grown men in the room instinctively take a step back. "Miss Vega," he said, without looking away from Marco, "please stand up." Marisol stood shakily. Dante walked, slowly, into the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He simply walked, and the room parted around him like water. He stopped in front of Marco Falzone. "You are in my restaurant," he said quietly. "You are eating food I have paid to have prepared for you. And you have just insulted a woman under my roof." Marco, for the first time, seemed to realize who he was looking at. The blood drained from his face. "Mr. Corvino, you will apologize to Miss Vega, now." And Marco Falzone, 28 years old, son of a construction empire, drunk on champagne, opened his mouth and closed it 3 times. Then he turned to Marisol and stammered out a wet, humiliated apology. Dante did not seem to hear it. He turned to the maitre d'. "Miss Vega will be escorted home tonight in a car. Paid. She is not to return to work until she wishes to. Her wages will continue in the meantime. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mr. Corvino." Then he turned to Marco. "The Falzone Development Group has 3 permits currently pending review by the City Planning Committee," he said, as calmly as if he were commenting on the weather. "By Monday morning, none of them will be approved. Your father will call you and ask what you have done. You will tell him the truth. Do you understand me?" Marco went white. "Yes, sir. Get out of my restaurant." The engagement party left in silence. Nobody argued. Nobody spoke. And Marisol, standing in her ruined apron, with dessert on her hands and tears on her face, looked up into the pale gray eyes of Dante Corvino and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that someone had chosen, publicly, to stand between her and the world. He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Vega," he said quietly, "I am sorry that happened to you." And then, before she could find any words, he had turned and walked out into the rain. The car took her home. She sat in the back, wrapped in a coat that someone had draped over her shoulders, and she cried quietly for the entire ride. Not because she was sad, exactly. Because for the first time in a very long time, she had been seen. She did not go back to work the next day. Or the day after. She sat in her small apartment and she tried to make sense of what had happened. She had asked around, carefully, and learned that 3 of the permits Falzone had been counting on had, indeed, been quietly denied. She had learned that Marco Falzone had indeed been humiliated by his father. She had learned that in the small whispered world of the restaurant, Mr. Corvino had never before intervened for a staff member. Not once. In 15 years. She had thought about him constantly. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was awe. She told herself over and over that it could not be anything else, because a man like that did not notice a woman like her. Elena, when she came to visit, had put her hands on her hips and laughed. "My God," she said, "he stood in the middle of his own restaurant and threatened a rich man's future because he called you fat. He sent a car. He is paying you to sit at home. And you think he did that because he was bored?" "He is a good man," Marisol had whispered. "He would do that for anyone." "He would not," Elena said. "And you know it." Marisol had not answered. She had only pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. She had gone back to work a week later, sad. She had gone back because she needed to. Because she needed to see him, and know if the way he had looked at her was real. He had not been there her first night back. Or her second. But on the 3rd night, a Tuesday, she had felt something shift in the air, and she had looked up from her sink, and through the pass, she had seen him sitting at the back table, watching her. She had lifted her hand, uncertainly, in something between a wave and a question. He had inclined his head. Just once, just enough. She had smiled before she could stop herself. And in the alcove, Silvio had cleared his throat and murmured, "You are smiling, boss. I am not." "You are. It is a small smile, but it is a smile. I have not seen one of those in 12 years. Dante had not answered. But he had not stopped watching her either. That was the week before, the night of the rain. That was the week before the poisoning. Because there had been another layer to all of this, one that Marisol did not know, and Dante was only beginning to see. Marco Falzone's father, Vincent Falzone, was not just an angry developer whose son had been humiliated. Vincent Falzone had been, for the last 2 years, the quiet architect of a small, dangerous rebellion against Dante Corvino's authority in the city. He had been making alliances. He had been moving money. He had been waiting for the right moment. And when his son came home shaking and when 3 permits vanished overnight, Vincent Falzone had decided he could not wait any longer. He would remove the king, directly, efficiently, permanently. He would do it in the one place the king felt safe. He would do it at the Corvino table. The night of the rain was a Friday. Dante Corvino arrived at 9, as always. He was alone. Silvio was, unusually, not with him, having been sent to handle a matter at one of the hotels. Dante ordered his usual, a bowl of pappardelle, with wild boar ragout, and a glass of Barolo. The kitchen was busy. Marisol was at her post. Hands deep in hot water, her back aching, her mind quietly turning over the memory of the small nod he had given her 3 days earlier. She did not know that, in the pantry, a new prep cook, hired 2 weeks ago on the recommendation of a supplier who was secretly a foul zone man, was carefully adding a colorless, tasteless powder to a small ramekin of finishing oil that was labeled, in careful black letters, Corvino table only. She did not know that the powder was a compound that would, within 20 minutes of ingestion, cause a catastrophic cardiac event that would look to any medical examiner exactly like a sudden and unfortunate heart attack in a man in his early 50s. She did not know any of this. She only knew that at 9:17 the swinging door to the kitchen slammed open, and a waiter she barely knew came stumbling in, his face bone white. "Mr. Corvino," he gasped. "Mr. Corvino has collapsed. Why?" The kitchen erupted. Bruno was screaming. The sous chef was on the phone with emergency services, shouting the address. 2 waiters were running back into the dining room. The maitre d' was hyperventilating in the doorway. And Marisol at her sink felt something inside her go absolutely still. She dropped the plate she was holding. It shattered. She ran. She pushed past Bruno, past the sous chef, past the frozen waiters, and she ran into the dining room, and she saw him. Dante Corvino was on the floor beside his table. His face was gray, his lips were blue. His hand was clutched, not at his chest, but at his throat, and his eyes, those cold, pale, gray eyes, were wide and full of a controlled, silent panic that she recognized immediately. Not a normal heart attack. She hit her knees beside him. Her nurse's mind, buried under 3 years of dishwater and dust, snapped back into place like a bone into a socket. Sir, can you hear me? Blink twice if you can hear me." He blinked. Twice. She was already moving. Her fingers were on his throat, feeling for his pulse. It was fast, wildly fast, then skipping. She checked his airway. Clear. She looked at his pupils. Blown wide. She lifted her head. "This is not a heart attack," she said loudly, clearly, cutting through the noise of the room. "This is a poisoning. Something cardiotoxic. Get me the ambulance on the phone now." "Now," the maitre d' stared at her. "Now," she snapped. He gave her the phone. Marisol Vega, in a wet apron with dessert stains still on the hem, spoke to the emergency dispatcher in the calm, exact voice of a nurse who had once run codes in a cardiac unit at 3 in the morning. She described his symptoms. She described the onset. She described exactly what she suspected. She told them to bring atropine. She told them to bring activated charcoal. She told them to bring a portable monitor, and to be ready to pace him. Then she turned back to Dante. "Sir," she said, holding his hand, "I know you are afraid. I need you to listen to me. Your heart is trying to stop. I am not going to let it. Do you understand?" He tried to speak. He could not. "Squeeze my hand." "If you understand," he squeezed. Weakly. But he squeezed. "Good. Good. Stay with me. Do not close your eyes. Look at me. Look right at me." She held his gaze. His breathing was slowing. She started chest compressions the moment she felt his pulse stutter and vanish. She counted, out loud, steady, precise, 30 compressions, and 2 breaths, the rhythm as familiar to her hands as her own name. Her arms burned, her back screamed. She did not stop. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. They found a large woman in a soaked apron kneeling in the middle of an empty restaurant, doing textbook CPR on the most powerful man in the city, calling out his vitals from memory as she worked. Male, approximately 50. Sudden collapse, suspected cardiotoxin ingestion, no known cardiac history. Pulse lost approximately 90 seconds ago. Compressions ongoing. Please prep atropine and get me a line. The lead paramedic stared at her for 1 full second. "Ma'am, who are you?" "I am a nurse," Marisol said, without stopping. "Move." They moved. They worked on him for 11 minutes on that floor. They shocked him twice. They pushed the atropine. Marisol never left his side. She held his hand while they cut open his shirt. She spoke to him, low and steady, telling him to stay, telling him he was not allowed to die in her restaurant, telling him the paramedics were good, they were very good, he only had to hold on. At one point, in the middle of the chaos, his eyes opened. They found her face. His fingers, gray and cold, tightened around hers with the last strength he had. And then they were loading him onto the gurney, and Marisol was climbing into the ambulance with him without asking anyone's permission, and the doors were slamming shut, and the sirens were screaming into the rainy night. At the hospital, they took him into surgery. Or rather, they took him into an emergency intervention that Marisol, standing in the hallway in her wet apron, understood better than she wanted to. They pumped his stomach. They confirmed within the hour what she had guessed at the first look: a synthesized cardiotoxin, designed to mimic natural cardiac arrest. He would live. He would live because a woman who had once been the top of her class in a cardiac unit 2,000 miles away had refused to be too small to matter. Silvio arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later, his suit soaked, his face the color of paper. He found Marisol sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway, staring at her own hands. He sat down next to her. "You are Marisol Vega," he said. She nodded, without looking up. "You saved his life. I did what I was trained to do." "You were trained to wash dishes?" She laughed wetly, a small broken laugh. "No, I was trained to be a nurse. In another country. A long time ago." Silvio was quiet for a long time. "He knew," he said finally. "He knew you were a nurse. He has known since your first week." Marisol looked up. "He read your file," Silvio said. "He has been reading it for 7 months. He knew your husband died. He knew your paperwork was stuck. He was the one who unstuck it. He was the one who arranged the scholarship for your mother. For. He was the one who paid for the car that took you home the night the Falzone boy called you what he called you. He was the one who quietly made sure that you would be safe every single night when you walked home in the dark." Hand. Marisol was crying now, very quietly. "Why?" she whispered. Silvio smiled gently. "Because in 30 years of knowing him," he said, "I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. He does not have the words for it. He is not a man who was taught the words, but that is what it is. That is what it has always been." The next morning Marisol was still there when Dante Corvino opened his eyes. He was pale. He was weak. He was hooked to more machines than she could count. But when his eyes found her, sitting in the chair beside his bed in a clean set of hospital scrubs someone had given her, she watched something shift in his face that she had never seen before. Relief. Naked, unguarded, human relief. "Miss Vega," he said. His voice was a rasp. "Marisol," she said softly, "please. Just Marisol." He looked at her for a long moment. "Marisol, yes, you saved my life. Yes." He closed his eyes for a second, as if the fact of it was too large to hold all at once. "You were a nurse. I was. I am. I always was. I know." She smiled, a small, trembling smile. "I know you know," she said. "Silvio told me." He opened his eyes. "I have done many things I did not tell you about. Silvio told me those too. Are you angry?" She thought about it honestly. For a long moment. "I do not know yet," she said. "I think I should be. I think I would be if it were anyone else, but when I was on the floor, with you, when I was doing compressions, when I was holding your hand, I already knew, somewhere. I already knew that you had been watching me. I do not know why I knew. But I did." He was silent. "Why?" she said, finally. "Why me? You could have anyone." He looked at her, and his pale gray eyes, for the first time since she had known him. "Because," he said slowly, as if pulling each word out of a place he did not usually visit, "the first time I walked into that kitchen, I saw a woman humming to herself while she washed other people's plates. And I thought that is the kindest person in this building. And every week after that, I would come and I would look at you through the door, and I would think, that is still the kindest person in this building. And then one day I realized I was arranging my week around the 2 nights I could look at you. And I realized I did not know what to do about it. Because I am not, Marisol, a man whose life is safe for a woman like you. And yet," she said quietly, "here I am. Here you are. I saved your life. You did. So maybe," she said, and her voice was shaking, but she said it anyway, "maybe your life is safe enough for me if I am the one who kept it." He looked at her for a long, long time. Then, very slowly, he lifted his hand from the sheet. It trembled with the effort. He held it out to her. She took it. He closed his eyes. "Do not go anywhere," he said. "I will not." The rest of that story, the story of what happened to Vincent Falzone and to the men who had built their little rebellion around him, was handled, mostly, without Marisol ever having to see it. Dante would not let her see it. He said quietly that the world she had chosen to walk into had ugly corners, and he wanted her to know they existed, but he did not want them to touch her. What she knew was this. Within 72 hours of his hospitalization, Silvio had traced the poison. Within a week, the prep cook had been found, and, in exchange for his testimony, had disappeared into a life somewhere very far from the city. Within a month, Vincent Falzone had been arrested on a mountain of federal charges related to fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Charges that had been assembled from an astonishingly detailed dossier that had appeared, anonymously, on the desk of a federal prosecutor. Vincent Falzone's empire had collapsed within a single financial quarter. His son Marco had, mercifully for himself, stayed very quiet. Dante Corvino recovered slowly. Marisol, who had refused to leave his side, worked with the hospital staff as though she had never left the profession. She monitored his vitals. She adjusted his pillows. She read to him when he could not sleep. She scolded him when he tried to work from his bed. The staff started calling her Nurse Vega. She did not correct them. 6 months later, on a bright afternoon in early autumn, Marisol Vega stood at the front of a small clinic in the east side of the city, cutting a ribbon that had been strung across the door. The clinic was called Casa Vega. It was a free community health center, funded, quietly and completely, by a private foundation that no one could quite trace. It served the neighborhood full of women like Marisol had been, women with degrees from other countries, women whose papers had been lost, women who deserved to work as more than shadows. Marisol was the clinic's director. She was also by then fully licensed to practice in this country. The paperwork had gone through with almost embarrassing speed once someone had apparently taken an interest in her case. She stood at the ribbon in a soft green dress that fit her large frame beautifully. Her round face flushed with sunlight, her hair pinned up, her wide hips balanced comfortably as she leaned in to make the cut. Elena was beside her, crying openly. The neighborhood was crowded around them, cheering. At the back of the crowd, in a dark suit, stood Dante Corvino. He was watching her, the way he had always watched her. Only now, everyone knew. When she had cut the ribbon, when the cheers had died down, when the neighbors had begun to file inside to see the exam rooms and the little pharmacy and the sunny waiting room with the plants she had chosen herself, Dante walked slowly to the front of the crowd. He did not speak loudly. He never did. But when he took her hand in front of everyone, and knelt, without any fanfare, on the sidewalk of a working-class street in front of a clinic she had built, the entire block went quiet. Marisol Vega, he said. She was already crying. You saved my life on a kitchen floor, he said. You have been saving it every day since. I have spent 30 years running an empire. I have made every decision I have ever made alone. I do not want to make another one without you. Will you marry me? Marisol looked down at the man who had once caught a rack of glasses to keep them from falling, at the man who had stood between her and a cruel word in a room full of silent watchers, at the man who had built, in secret, a small, invisible fortress around her life long before she knew he existed. Yes, she said. Yes, Dante, yes. He rose. He kissed her gently. In front of the whole neighborhood, somewhere in the back of the crowd, Silvio was laughing and wiping his eyes at the same time. They were married 3 months later, in a small ceremony that Marisol had insisted on keeping simple. Elena was her maid of honor. Silvio stood beside Dante, Marisol's mother, flown in for the occasion, wept through the entire vows. Casa Vega grew, over the next 2 years, into a network of 3 clinics. Marisol was a fierce, gentle, unstoppable director. She hired other immigrant nurses and doctors whose papers had been trapped. She fought their cases. She won most of them. Dante, meanwhile, became something the city had not seen before. Still the silent king, still the man whose name made bankers stutter. But now, on Tuesday and Friday nights, he was often seen at a small table in a bright, unfussy clinic, waiting for a large, plus-size woman in scrubs to finish her last patient, so he could take her out for pappardelle. End quote. He never once ordered the finishing oil. The rest of that story is quieter than the beginning, which is perhaps how the best story should end. Because in the end, this was never a story about a mafia boss dying on a kitchen floor. Not really. It was a story about a woman the world had decided not to see, and the one man in that world who saw her anyway. It was a story about how the strongest kind of power is not the power to destroy, but the power to protect. It was a story about how a set of hands trained to heal are worth more than a room full of hands trained only to take. It was a story about how, sometimes, the person who looks the smallest in the room is the only one large enough to keep the whole world from falling apart. Marisol Vega had come to that city with a suitcase and a diploma no one would honor. She had washed dishes for 7 months and 11 days, and on one rainy Friday night, when a king had fallen and everyone else had frozen, she was the only person in the room who had understood what was happening. Because she had always been more than what people saw. She had only been waiting, quietly, to be given the chance to prove it. And Dante Corvino, the silent king, learned in the end what he had never been taught. That love is not a weakness in a man of power. That the greatest use of every dollar he had ever earned and every soldier he had ever commanded was in the end to build a small clinic on a working-class street and place a soft green ribbon in the hand of the woman who had once, on a wet tile floor, refused to let his heart stop beating. The kitchen, where it happened, is still open. Different staff now, different menu. But sometimes, late at night, when the last plates are being scrubbed and the last lights are being turned off, the newer employees swear they can hear, very faintly, a woman humming to herself by the industrial dishwasher. A soft, warm, patient sound. The sound of a person who is exactly where she is meant to be. The sound of a person who was, all along, worth so much more than anyone ever thought. And that in the end is the whole story.